John Palmer joins me this week to discuss the role of water in beer brewing. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 237. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 237, and it's mid-June 2021. John Palmer joins me this week to discuss the role of water in beer brewing. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brew house controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brew house controller that offers automated step meshing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, go to blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's blickmanengineering.com. And finally, I'm happy to say that the new web-based version of BeerSmith is available now at beersmithrecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, view, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. The new web version gives you access to tens of thousands of recipes, online recipe editing, advanced water tools, and more from any device. You can try BeerSmith Web for 30 days free by signing up for an account at beersmithrecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version of BeerSmith for one low price. Existing BeerSmith Gold or higher members also get the web version for free. Check out beersmithrecipes.com now to give BeerSmith Web a try. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back John Palmer. John is the author of the top-selling homebrew book in the world, How to Brew, as well as the definitive book on brewing water and brewing classic styles. Today, he joins us to talk about water in beer brewing. John, it's great to have you on the show. How you doing?
Thanks, Brad. It's great to be here.
It's over, let's say, been over a year since I had you on last time, and right. I know you've been very busy. What projects have you been up to lately?
Well, mostly, in the past year, the pandemic, mostly been working here at home, doing my editing job for the Master Brewers Association, working on the Technical Quarterly Journal, and working on a couple of books by other authors. Got an interesting one coming up. Should be released later this fall of 2021 on the surprising history and legacy of American adjunct lager.
Really? And what is American adjunct lager? I don't know. I'm not even familiar with it.
Well, that is your Bud Miller Coors type American lager beer. And the focus of the book is how this style was created in 1860, 1870, and evolved right up until the turn of the 20th century, and has long been a very respected and copied style of beer around the world. Little wrinkle there with Prohibition, and then coming back afterwards. But what so many of today's brewers don't recognize is the long history of this style. They assume it was fairly recent, after World War II. But that's not the case. So very interesting book.
That is pretty cool. But today you wanted to discuss water, which is a challenging topic for many brewers. So let's start with water sources. I know, first of all, it's important to understand the kind of water you're working with, right? And what's actually coming out of your tap.
Right. There's two basic kinds of water. You have surface water sources, which are your lakes, rivers, streams, and so on, that comes from precipitation. And then you have your groundwater sources, the aquifers, the springs, and so on, that, water comes up from underground. And the two types are very different and will produce very different beers. Surface water sources are typically low in mineral content, but high in organic content. And by organics, I mean stuff like algae, organic off flavors and aromas. And the city will often add quite a bit of chlorine to surface water sources to knock down any biologic activity in the water.
Mm-hmm.
So you often have to contend with the chlorine. Groundwater sources, on the other hand, are often high in mineral content, particularly alkalinity, and you may need to treat that water to demineralize it in order to produce a particular beer style. Groundwater sources, on the other hand, are typically quite clean, low in organic odors and aromas and flavors, and don't require as much chlorine to treat them. But the alkalinity is a big issue.
That's interesting. Yeah, we have a well here, and my water is almost pure with a little bit of alkalinity, but very, very clean, surprisingly. Yeah. So what are some of the ways you can test or get data on your local water supply?
Well, you can get the water report from the city, and that'll give you a good, annual average of what's in the water, and it'll probably give you a range of the different minerals that are in it. What's important to understand about your water source, though, are the 6 prime brewing elements, which are, make up 99% of the mineral content of the water. Mm-hmm. And these are calcium, magnesium, total alkalinity, sulfate, chloride, and sodium. Those are your 6 items of interest when it comes to your water report.
And I've also seen bicarbonates, but I think you can convert the bicarbonates to total alkalinity, right?
Right. Bicarbonate is the majority of alkalinity in our water. We talk about total alkalinity of the water supply because your carbonates can consist of a couple of different species, that is, different forms depending on the pH of the water. I go into this a lot more in how to brew in case, this starts getting into the weeds. But essentially, alkalinity is composed of carbonate and bicarbonate. Mm-hmm. But in potable water, that is your tap water that generally has a pH somewhere from say 7 to 9, 97% of your total alkalinity is represented by bicarbonate. So you may just see the bicarbonate number, and that's 97% of the answer.
Right, and there's a very simple formula, and I don't remember off the top of my head to switch between the two. So if you see one or the other, you can kind of use one or the other.
Easy to convert, yeah.
So you mentioned the local water report or the water test kits.
Yeah.
Lab. You can send to labs too, right?
Yeah. Very popular service is Ward Labs in Nebraska. They do a lot of water testing for agricultural purposes, but they're also amiable to doing brewing water testing. And you send them a small bottle of water, and for like $20, they'll let you know what the mineral content is. It's pretty easy to do. There are also home water test kits, and these are like the Lamont Brew Lab, which I helped develop. And this is like a swimming pool dropper test kit kind of thing. Mm-hmm. You take a water sample, put in a color reagent, and then count the number of drops of another reagent, such as an acid or a base, to affect a color change in the sample. And you multiply that number of drops by 10 typically, and that's your parts per million of, say, calcium or alkalinity. So it takes, 15, 20 minutes to do a water test, but very repeatable, easy to do. Total cost of the test is about $2 in terms of, if you buy a kit, it's good for about 100 tests or so, at least.
So you get your base water, right? And you've got some idea of what the 6 big ions are in your base water.
Yeah.
And I believe there's ways, you can look in your book or any number of sources to find if you're kind of in the good range, if you have too much of something, for example.
Right.
But how do you then adjust it up or down? What's the next step? And why do you do that, most importantly, I guess?
Yeah. Well, the reason we talk about adjusting water, the main reason is adjusting your mash pH. Mash pH is a big deal when it comes to determining the final character of your beer. because the mash pH influences the wort pH, and the wort pH influences the beer pH, and the beer pH affects beer's flavors expression. So, first thing, though, is mash pH, because we are trying to ensure good conversion of starches to sugars.
Mm-hmm.
Now, nature has arranged it such that when you do your mash with base malt, you typically get a distilled water mash pH of about 5.8.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're using alkaline water, which would tend to buffer the chemical reactions, it drives that pH up a little bit. So you may have a mash pH of, say, 6 as opposed to 5.8. And that's fine as far as the amylase, the starch conversion enzymes are concerned. They work perfectly happily up at pH of 6. But in terms of beer flavor, it's a little too high. And you start running into issues with astringency and just coarse flavors. So as brewers, we have determined empirically over the years that a lower mash pH, somewhere between 5.2 and 5.6, is preferable in terms of overall beer character and flavor, while still allowing the enzymes to work well. If the mash pH goes too low, if you add too much acid, for example, and the pH gets below 5, now you start inhibiting those amylase enzymes, and you can hurt your conversion of starches to sugars and have low yield. So that's one thing to be aware of at the low end, whereas at the high end, where the enzymes are still working happily, around pH 6, that's when you start running into astringency problems with the beer. So as brewers, going back to the original question, we are adjusting our water to adjust that mash pH to get it into that 5.2 to 5.6 range.
And of course, that's not the only reason we adjust our water, right? You have some other reasons for flavor purposes, right?
Right. There are other reasons. The primary reason is that mash pH one. From there, once we got that dialed in, we say, okay, now how is this water helping the flavor of our beer? And this is where it's important to understand that beer and brewing is food and cooking. Okay? When you are cooking something on the stove, you don't worry about your water source. Typically, you are going to add some salt, you're going to add some seasonings, and you're going to adjust the flavor of this dish that you're making to your own taste. It's the same with beer. Beer and brewing is food and cooking. So how do we season our beer? Well, we season the beer by the use of calcium salts and magnesium salts, such as calcium sulfate and calcium chloride. And we talk about the sulfate to chloride ratio. Now, the way this works is that you have these calcium salts that are naturally dissolved in water. And when you look at your water report, you're going to see ranges for calcium, magnesium, sulfate, chloride, sodium, etc. Sulfate acts to dry out the character of the beer and to accentuate the hop character. It makes the hop character of the beer a little more assertive and a little more crisp. Kind of dries out the character of the beer. Chloride, on the other hand, and as well as sodium, act like table salt on your food, and they tend to enhance and sweeten the malty character of the beer. So in terms of adjusting the seasoning of a particular beer, you can play with these calcium and chloride, these sulfate and chloride salts to accentuate the hoppiness of the beer or accentuate the maltiness of the beer. And you can also kind of get them into a 1-to-1 concentration, so you have a balanced profile. But it's a subtle thing. You can't make a malty beer hoppy by adding lots of sulfate. And you
Right.
can't do it, and you can't do it the other way around either. This is enhancement. It is strictly seasoning. It's not creation.
Mhm.
So that's an important point. And you don't want to oversalt your food either, right? You know what happens when you oversalt your food. It just, you really taste that, and it tastes minerally. So it's the same with your beers. So we have the one seasoning aspect is the sulfate to chloride to accentuate the flavor balance of the beer. The third leg there is mineral structure, or the amount of seasoning. And literally how much salt do you put into the water to accentuate these flavors in your beer? You can do a little bit, like Bohemian Pilsner, or you can do a lot, like Dortmunder Export. And that is what I refer to as mineral structure. How much mineral content in the water is supporting the beer's flavors.
And while we're on this, you did mention the Beer Cube. You sent me a copy of this thing, and which kind of just as a diagram that shows this. I'm going to put it up on the screen, but maybe you can describe it for folks that are listening here.
Sure. Yeah, in the latest edition of How to Brew, in the 2017 edition, on page, I forget now, 394, I think it is, chapter 22 on water, I have a diagram that I call the Brew Cube. And if you picture a Rubik's Cube, you use this diagram by defining the beer style that you're going to brew by 3 parameters: the flavor balance, hoppy, balanced, or malty; the beer color, pale, amber, or dark; and the beer structure, soft, medium, or firm. Those are the 3 parameters that you use to define the beer style. Those correspond to 3 water parameters, and these being the amount of calcium in the water, the residual alkalinity of the water, and the sulfate to chloride ratio. So your beer flavor balance corresponds to your sulfate to chloride ratio. More sulfate makes that a hoppier character. More chloride makes it a maltier character. The beer color, pale, amber, or dark, corresponds to residual alkalinity. And residual alkalinity is a measure of the buffering power that the water has to that in essence resists the drop in pH from the water's pH down to the mash pH.
Yeah, I've often described that, I guess, is how hard it is to move your mash pH, right?
Yes, that's a very good way of describing it. So in a water with high residual alkalinity, plus 100, that mash pH is not going to come down very much. It's going to stay up near around 5.8 to 6. And often, depending on the style of beer you're brewing, you may need to add acid to the water to counteract that and neutralize that alkalinity. If the residual alkalinity of the water is near 0, this means that it has, it's not as much resistance to pH movement. And that works very well for amber beers. It takes the distilled water mash pH of base malt at 5.8, and the water content and the other specialty malts that you add help bring that pH down to that 5.2 to 5.6 range. And you're able to do that with just the addition of some specialty malts.
Mm-hmm.
If you're brewing a pale beer without specialty malts, then you need a negative residual alkalinity, that is more hardness than alkalinity in the water, to assist that pH drop. Mm-hmm. And you may need acid as well. And there's lots of brewing software, such as BeerSmith, out there that'll help you calculate how much is needed.
And quite often you do, particularly for a pale beer, you do end up adding some acid, right?
Right. Yeah. Usually you'll add, I guess, taking a step back, when it comes to water adjustment in general, if you have a surface water source that has low minerals, it's easy to add calcium salts to that water to get up to the recommended level of calcium, which is typically 50 ppm, up to, say, a good medium level of 100. Somewhere in that 50 to 100 is your typical range for most styles. And so you'll do that, and then, lost the train of thought. Then you could add acid as well to assist that pH drop. But again, BeerSmith and so on will calculate how much that is for you.
Well, I wanted to dive into the mash pH a little bit more. You've covered
Sure.
the seasoning to some degree here, but let's talk about mash pH. So let's just start at the very beginning, and we'll kind of walk through it. So you start with some base water that has a certain residual alkalinity, which kind of defines again how hard it is to move that mash pH, right?
Right.
And that water is generally slightly alkaline, which means it has a pH of a little over 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're going to add acidic malts to it, right? And can you talk about, for example, the difference between adding dark malts and light malts to and how that affects the mash pH?
Sure. Yeah. So your base malts, your Pilsner malt, your two-row, your pale ale malt, those are all base malts, and they typically have a mash pH of about 5.8. And this is if you mash them into distilled water.
Right, because all the malts have some acidity, right?
Well, in point of fact, you have to, when you're talking about acidity versus alkalinity, you always have to cite your reference point. So in terms of our target mash pH of 5.2 to 5.6, your base malts represent an alkaline quantity.
Right.
Their pH needs to come down to our target range. Specialty malts, on the other hand, where you've developed some amount of color by kilning or roasting, the darker they are in general, the more acidity is created in that malt, and the more acidic it is. So they'll have a distilled water mash pH of, say, 4.5. So their pH, the pH of that malt needs to come up to our target range of 5.2 to 5.6. And going back to source water, as you're saying, the residual alkalinity is how hard it is to move those pHs. Mm-hmm. And surface water, as I was saying, doesn't have much minerals. It's easy to add salts to get to hit your targets. Groundwater sources, though, typically have, at least in North America, a lot of alkalinity. And there are a few extremes, such as the northern Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the Dakotas, where you'll have 300, 400 parts per million of alkalinity in the water, mm-hmm. which really makes that water almost unbrewable.
I don't mean to interrupt, but that brings up an interesting question now. How do you adjust if your base water is too high? Let's say it's not, you get the 6 water ion report and your base water has too much total alkalinity, or it has too much calcium or whatever.
Right. Too much calcium is not a problem. It's too much alkalinity that's the problem.
Yeah.
And like I say, it could be 200, 300, 400. That's where you are using acid to neutralize that alkalinity before you brew. So you'd put, 10 gallons, 20 gallons of water in your hot liquor tank, or however you're creating your brewing water, and you would add several milliliters of acid to it. And what that would do is it would convert the carbonate and bicarbonate in the water to carbon dioxide. Then you would stir the water, and you would see that water fizz, and that carbon dioxide would be vented to the air. So that's how you neutralize alkalinity. Mm-hmm. And so this is why adding acid is very, very common in commercial breweries, because it's such an easy measurable way of adjusting water to the purpose of the recipe.
And we didn't cover the addition of dark malts too helps too, right?
Right. We'll get to. I'll get to that in just a second. No worries. You are keeping me on track, so I appreciate it. When you add acid to water, you need to be aware of the type of acid that you're adding: phosphoric, lactic, hydrochloric. These acids have an anion component, the lactate ion, which has an aroma or a flavor. In the case of phosphoric acid, which is very common, there's already lots of phosphates in the malt and the beer, so you don't notice the flavor of that acid in regard to the beer. But it can take a lot of acid to neutralize these very high alkalinities. And in the case of lactic acid, you can often taste a lactic aspect afterwards, which is usually undesired. So that's one thing to be aware of. Now, going back to dark malts. In general, as I said, when you kiln or roast malts to develop color in them, you are creating Maillard reactions, which results in the creation of acidic compounds. Some of these are color compounds, some of these are their heterocyclic compounds that have some natural acidity to them. And all of these compounds are buffers that can counteract or dominate the alkaline buffers in the water. So if you have a water that has high residual alkalinity, you can add dark malts, such as caramel malts or roast malts, to that mash, and the natural acidity of those malts will help bring that mash pH back into balance and help us hit our target of 5.2 to 5.6. The one thing to be aware of is that it's your highest color caramel malts that have the most acidity.
Interesting.
And as you transition from kilning, which is what is used to create these caramel malts, to roasting, and this transition is like 325 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you start actually burning these compounds and not caramelizing them, but browning them, polymerizing them, breaking them down, and actual acidity starts being lost, even though the malt is getting darker. So it's your highest color caramel malts that have the most acidity. Your roast malts, such as chocolate, black malt, roasted barley, they generally have less acidity, something corresponding more to like a Crystal 60 malt or a Crystal 80 malt, rather than, say, the Crystal 120 or the Crystal 180, which would be the most acidic.
And those are right in the middle of that, what we call the harsh zone, right?
They can be, yes.
I'm talking about the very dark crystals, for example, are in the harsh zone. Randy Mosher coined that term, I think.
Yes, that's a very good point. You do start bumping up into, in terms of Lovibond, like 180, 200, 200 Lovibond, 400 SRM. Sorry, no. 200 Lovibond, 200 SRM, 400 EBC. That's right in that harsh zone, where to create that amount of color, you've created some very dry, astringent tasting flavor compounds. So, great point.
Interesting.
So so it helps looking at the Brew Cube. Think about what the color of the beer is going to be, the color of that recipe. Think about how much specialty malt is needed to balance the residual alkalinity of the water. And as you puzzle on that, think about your calcium levels. You're looking for generally 50 to 100 ppm of calcium that you want in the water. Calcium is very important for fermentation reactions, flocculation, beer clarity. Magnesium is also very important for yeast health. Generally, we're looking at 50 ppm of calcium for a soft water profile or beer profile, mineral structure, 100 ppm of calcium for a medium amount of mineral structure, 150 for firm. And there's only two beer styles that I can think of that qualify for that firm level, those being Dortmunder Export and Burton Pale Ale. Every other style is really much, it is in that 100 ppm medium or 50 ppm soft category. Yeah. You don't need a lot of salts in your water, and too much salt is just going to make your beer taste minerally. So keep those limits in mind.
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, okay, coming up for air, where are we right now?
Well, so I wanted to actually switch topics. The whole discussion that we've been exchanging emails here started when a customer actually asked me about adjusting a water profile to match a particular style or city profile. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think about that. I mean, trying to match now we have these profiles that are available by style, and we also have profiles available for given cities, which are often tied to like Pilsen is tied to Budvar or whatever. So what do you think about this whole approach where we sort of take the water profiles and we try and match a particular city or perhaps a particular beer style? Sure.
Well, yeah, it's important to understand how our understanding of water has evolved over the last couple hundred years. We look to these classic brewing cities to help us understand how did that water help create this classic beer style. So again, it goes to understanding what's important about the water, and that is the calcium, magnesium, alkalinity, sulfate, chloride, and sodium. Those are the factors that affect the beer. Your calcium, magnesium, and alkalinity are the ions that affect pH.
Mm-hmm.
Your sulfate, chloride, and sodium are the ones that affect flavor. Okay? Mm-hmm. So if you look at a classic brewing city, in the case of Pilsen, it's an interesting one because the water there is almost like pure rainwater, very low mineral. Every ion is less than 10 ppm.
Mm-hmm.
And from a brewer's point of view, anything less than 50 ppm is a low concentration, especially if it's below 20. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Pilsen is just like darn near rainwater.
Like
it's
distilled
really
water or something, huh?
Yeah. Many years ago, I was at a conference and was introduced to Professor Ludwig Narcissus, who's, author, highly respected brewing author, written some great textbooks, all in German, of course. And I asked him, how did the Pilsen brewers achieve good mash pH and such delicate beer flavor with such low mineral water? And he said, they use salts. And I said, oh, really? Yes, they added salts to their beer, to the water. He said, at the time when Pilsen beer was created, Burtonization of water was high technology. It was known, it was understood, it was talked about and written about. So they added salts to the water to allow them to brew these nice beers. And that was a revelation for me.
Interesting. What do you mean by Burtonization? Can you say?
Sure.
I was obviously referring to Burton-on-Trent, I assume.
Yeah. So, Burton-on-Trent has long been recognized as a unique location and a famous brewing city, if you will. And it's due to the high amount of hardness in the water, a large amount of calcium, magnesium, as well as sulfate in the water that allowed the brewers to brew very assertive beers, very clear beers.
Mm-hmm.
Burton was known for brewing clear beers when many other breweries around the country, in the UK and the world, tended to be hazy and cloudy. And against that high calcium content that helps promote flocculation and clarification of the beer. And it's interesting to understand that this realization that it was something in the water And they measured it using chemistry 200 years ago, 300 years ago. They knew that it was the calcium and the sulfate levels that made that water unique. And so they started adding calcium salts to other styles and other locations to enhance the water. So that's where I think the term Burtonization was coined about 100 years later.
Mm-hmm.
But the act of adding these calcium salts to other water sources to improve the beer was well known and understood. And as you said, we call that Burtonization today. It's interesting to note that pH was not created. The concept and definition of pH was not created until around 1920.
Interesting.
Just a little over 100 years ago. So, but 200 years before that, scientists and brewing scientists knew the importance of these minerals in the water. They just had less ways to measure them than we do today.
Kind of like yeast, right? We didn't know about yeast for a long time.
That's right.
Louis Pasteur, right?
Yeah. So when we're going back to the original question,
go ahead.
Brewing cities. So it's important to understand what it is about these brewing cities that made them famous. And it's understanding these levers, the calcium, magnesium, alkalinity, sulfate, chloride, sodium, understanding how those concentrations in those cities help develop those famous beer styles. And so targeting a particular brewing city can be useful, it kind of misses the point.
Okay.
The point is to understand what it was about the water that facilitated or improved the character of the beer. And that's where I came up, that's what led to the creation of the Brew Cube, is understanding how these water parameters and style parameters relate to one another. Calcium level to beer structure, because calcium is unique in that it affects everything. Mm-hmm. It affects the residual alkalinity, which impacts your mash pH, and then as well as which calcium salt you're adding affects the sulfate to chloride, which affects the flavor balance. So, if you are trying to brew a style name a style, Brad, just one that comes to the top of your head.
I don't know. Burton Pale Ale.
Burton Pale Ale. Okay. So it's a pale beer. So you're looking for low residual alkalinity. And that means more hardness than alkalinity in the water. Burton Pale Ale is a pale ale. It has a fairly hoppy character. So you're generally going to want more sulfate than chloride in that water. Mm-hmm. Suggested ratios are anything like 2-to-1 up to 4-to-1 sulfate to chloride. And Burton Pale Ale is a fairly minerally character.
Yeah.
So that's one of these two styles that you're looking for that highest amount of calcium, like around somewhere between 100 and 150 ppm of calcium concentration. So you'd be taking your source water and looking at your mineral levels and saying, okay, I'm targeting calcium level between, say, 100 and 150, and I'm starting with, say, 50. So you're going to add some calcium salts, and you want higher sulfate than chloride, so you're probably going to add calcium sulfate or gypsum to that water. That's what's going to help you, embrace this, little more minerally, assertive, hoppy character that characterizes the style. You don't necessarily want to target, the original Burton-on-Trent water. What you want to understand is what made that water, appropriate to the style, and then take that knowledge and apply it so that beer it tastes the best to you. Because beer and brewing is food and cooking. Your taste perceptions are what are important.
I did want to ask, so we did talk about water salts, and of course, water salts can increase an ion, but it can't really decrease it. So how do you go about decreasing ion, maybe to get to a profile that you want or a target that you want?
Yeah. Well, the best
dilute or...
Yeah, you can dilute with distilled water.
Mm-hmm.
Buy some distilled water from the grocery store and dilute, to knock down your mineral levels that way, reduce your alkalinity. You can add acid to reduce the alkalinity, to change the carbonates to carbon dioxide and evolve it. Rarely do you have high hardness that needs to be reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of brewers tell me, "Oh, I've got such hard brewing water. I have all this calcium scale all over my equipment and the sink and so on." It's like, it's really high alkalinity that's the problem.
Mm.
Your calcium levels are typically only around 50 to 60, maybe 70 ppm for most of North America. If you're talking about groundwater, generally doesn't get much higher than that, and those amounts are fine for brewing. Those are the kind of targets we're looking for brewing liquor. It's the alkalinity that comes with that water that's often 200 ppm, 300 ppm. That's the real problem. So that's why we don't recommend water softening for treating your brewing water,
right?
Because typical water softening replaces the calcium and magnesium with sodium, so you have all the alkalinity and no calcium,
right?
Which is like the opposite of what you want to do.
Right.
So that's where water softening doesn't work. Now we do have reverse osmosis systems available these days, and reverse osmosis forces the water through a very fine membrane and is able to filter out all of the ions, or most of the ions in the water.
Yeah, almost the same as distilled water, right?
Right. You get all your mineral levels down below 10 ppm, which is essentially zero. Because, again, in terms of the order of magnitude, the concentrations we're talking about for brewing, somewhere between 50 and 100 ppm, 5, 10 ppm is nothing. It's in the noise.
Mm-hmm.
So, reverse osmosis is a great way to treat your water for brewing if you're on a well or something and have high alkalinity. And agricultural runoff is another big problem for both groundwater and surface water sources. You can get high nitrates. You can get a bacteria that can be in the water, and reverse osmosis and other filtration technologies, carbon filtration, for example, can be very useful for treating these waters before you brew with them.
Well, let's talk about the last topic I think you want to cover was magnesium, and magnesium is often overlooked by brewers because it's a really small number. But you had sent me some notes saying you wanted to highlight that magnesium actually is very important.
Yeah, and this is information that has really, I guess, gotten more interest in the last couple of years. I didn't cover it in the latest edition of How to Brew. Wasn't really aware of it, but we usually don't talk about magnesium much. We always talk about calcium, even though I knew and we've always known that magnesium is important for yeast health.
Right.
We just said, okay, they only need 5, 10 ppm, for health, and the mash is going to supply about 100 ppm. The malt is going to supply about 100 ppm of magnesium, so it's plenty. Don't need to worry about it. What's interesting about this is that we have come to better understand how the yeast sees calcium and magnesium. And in essence, as the yeast cell is sitting there in the wort and saying, okay, I'm taking in sugars, I'm creating energy, I'm producing these waste products that these people like to drink, they say we need magnesium. But there's all this calcium in the water that's kind of blocking their access to the magnesium. When we brew with reverse osmosis water, we've stripped out all the minerals, and we're typically putting in calcium salts to get us back up to our our calcium and sulfate targets.
Right.
No magnesium. So the yeast is getting some magnesium from the malt, but if we've added 150 ppm of calcium to the water, and there's calcium in the malt as well, the yeast may be seeing a preponderance of calcium in the water and can't really get access to the magnesium. Yeast scientists are recommending now that we maintain a high magnesium to calcium ratio of at least 1:1, preferably 2:1 in terms of total magnesium to total calcium, to better allow the yeast to access the magnesium they really need. So if you are making an IPA, a West Coast IPA, and you're putting in lots of calcium sulfate, make sure you use magnesium sulfate as part of that addition as well. Because while the malt is supplying about 100 ppm, you want to think in terms of total calcium and total magnesium in the wort, and you want to at least maintain parity, if not a little extra magnesium from the yeast point of view.
So if you walk me through this for a minute, so you get about 100 ppm from the malt itself. So does that, let's say I have 150 ppm. Well, it's probably extreme, but 150 ppm of calcium.
Yeah.
And I get 100 ppm of magnesium. Do I need to add 50 ppm of magnesium up front then?
You could.
Yeah.
That would be in line with the scientific recommendation.
The guidance, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of focusing on yeast health and, healthy fermentation. You also have to look at it from the other direction and say, okay, but how is that affecting the beer flavor? Is it still a net positive, or am I getting some weird sourness from too much magnesium in the beer? So that aspect has not been fully explored yet. And again, this is rather new, but at least you are correct in terms of, maintaining this equilibrium of calcium and magnesium. We probably do want to start adding magnesium to our water as well. You do kind of wonder how much is good and how much is too much.
Yeah, I think the current guidelines, at least I think the ones from How to Brew, were roughly 10 to 50 was sort of the range that you'd have in your base water, I think.
Yeah. Magnesium typically exists at about 10 to 20 ppm. Mm-hmm. High would be 30.
Right.
The various textbooks, don't recommend going higher than 80 ppm in the water, because again, like we said, there's going to be magnesium, coming from the malt. So greater than say 100 or 180, 200 ppm in the wort may be a source of off flavor. But at the same time, if we're getting, say, 50 ppm of calcium coming from the malt, and we have 150 ppm in the water that we've put in, that's, probably right around that 1:1. Yeah, maybe a little bit too much calcium. So you'd want to back off on the calcium a little bit and add some more magnesium. And I think adding up to 50 ppm magnesium in your water is probably fine. Probably, it's a good insurance to help maintain this magnesium to calcium ratio of greater than 1:1 without impacting flavor negatively.
Awesome. Well, John, we're actually running low on time, but I thought I'd get your closing thoughts on the whole topic and how to approach, kind of adjusting your water.
Yeah. So the key to water adjustment is to understand why you're adjusting it and how to adjust it. You don't have to match classic Brewing Cities. There's no single recipe for perfect brewing water. It is food and cooking. It is, how you perceive the flavor of the beer. There are these guidelines for mash pH and beer pH, and flavor balance, but it really is up to you on how much sulfate and chloride that you want in this water to enhance the flavor of your recipe.
Awesome. Well, thank you, John. I really appreciate you coming on the show today and telling us some more about water, especially some of the latest research. Very exciting.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Yeah.
So today, my guest was John Palmer. He's the author of the top-selling book, How to Brew, as well as the definitive book on water. And John, once again, thank you.
You're very welcome. Great to be here.
A big thank you to John Palmer for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And also the Brew Commander, the new brew house controller from Blickman Engineering. It's available in electric and gas propane models. The patent-pending Brew Commander is a high-quality brew house controller that offers automated step mashing, boil timers, precision temperature control, and advanced settings. Command your brew day with the new Brew Commander. To order yours today, visit blickmanengineering.com. And finally, I'm happy to say that the new web-based version of BeerSmith is available now at BeerSmithRecipes.com. BeerSmith for the web lets you build, edit, and brew recipes from any browser, including your desktop, tablet, or mobile device. You can try BeerSmith for the web free for 30 days by setting up an account at BeerSmithRecipes.com. If you purchase a Gold, Platinum, or Pro license, you get both BeerSmith Web and the desktop version of BeerSmith for one low price. Existing members with Gold or higher membership also get the web version for free. Check out BeerSmithRecipes.com to give it a try today. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.